Hey, what's up? Welcome back to my channel. My name is Gabby and today we're going to be discussing my December wrap-up because in the month of December I managed to read 15 books, which is not the most books that I've read in a month this year. It's actually on the lower side for me, but also considering the fact that I've been putting a lot of time and energy into videos as opposed to reading this month, I'm still pretty surprised with how much I was able to read, because December is usually one of my lowest reading months of the year because I'm so much more focused on my content usually in the month of December, so I'm happy with 15 books. And out of those 15 books, I had 3 horror books, 4 thrillers, 4 romances, 1 contemporary, 1 graphic novel, and 2 poetry collections. I did want to mention that I had 6 rereads this month. I actually expected to have a little bit more than that, but I ended up only having 6 rereads for the whole month, and it would actually be 7 rereads if I count November 9, but I'm actually not going to include this one because I DNF'd it 100 pages in. I also wanted to mention that I did attempt to reread The Charm Offensive because that's one of the ones that I really did guaranteed want to reread this month, but I started listening to the audiobook and I wasn't a huge fan of this audiobook, so I just set it aside because I didn't want to ruin any aspect of the story for me, and I had such a great experience reading it physically that I just wanted to leave it at that. But anyways, my ratings for this month, I had 6 5-star books this month, but again, this is mostly because of my rereading this month. And then I had 4 4 stars, 3 3 stars, and 2 2 stars. Wow, that went perfectly in sync. And then I also wanted to mention that I listened to 7 audiobooks this month. So wow, I actually read some books with my eyes this month. What a freaking concept. Alright, so starting off this month, the very first book that I read was The Collective. We're following this woman named Camille, and her teenage daughter was killed and was murdered 5 years ago. And now the guy who's responsible is just walking free and winning awards and living his best life. Camille goes to this event right at the beginning of this book. She goes to this event where he's winning this award and she yells murderer into the crowd, and this woman goes up to her all casual and slides her a card, and she's like, this is for people like us. And she ends up finding this online forum called The Collective, which is basically a group of grieving mothers whose children were basically murdered or taken against their will, and it's the job of the collective to get revenge or get justice for their children. And this concept was absolutely fascinating. I do think the tone of this book was a little bit hard to navigate at times because obviously this is some really heavy and sad subject matter, these mothers, these grieving mothers dealing with their loss. But yeah, this book was really intense. It was fast paced. I read it all within 1 day because I just couldn't put it down. It has major good for her energy, similarly to They Never Learn. It kind of has that vibe, but also I feel like this book is a little bit heavier than you might expect because it's dealing with these grieving mothers who have lost their children. It has this really sad undertone to this book. But yeah, it was a great time. I gave it 4 stars. It's not a new all-time favorite thriller for me, but it was a fun time to read while I was reading it. And then the second book that I read this month was A Dowry of Blood, and I actually only ended up reading this one because it was one of the only few books I had to read in order to read the top 10 horror Goodreads choices for the year. So I ended up reading it because of that. I honestly probably would have never picked this book up otherwise. And this one ended up being a 5-star book for me, so wow, amazing. I'm usually not the biggest fan about reading about vampires, but I've gotta say that this is one of the most beautifully written books that I think I've ever read. I'm really obsessed with the writing style. Here's an example of what the writing kind of sounds like. She said, I wanted to dash myself against your rocks like a wave, to obliterate my old self and see what rose shining and new from the sea foam. The only words I had to describe you in those early days were plunging cliffside or primordial sea, crystal cold stars or black expanse of sky. I dove down deep into your psyche, turning over every word you gave me like a jewel, looking for meaning, seeking out the mysteries of you. I didn't care if I lost myself in the process. Is this not the most beautiful ass writing you've ever heard? Also, I think the writing style of this book was really fascinating because in this book, we're following this woman who's a bride of Dracula, and he has several, and it's almost like she's writing this book like you are Dracula, she's writing it to you. So interesting because the writing is almost directed at the reader. It's just a really interesting writing style. And of course, because it's about vampires, there were a few scenes that were really disturbing and really gross, because I'm just I'm really squeamish about the idea of vampires because ew. But yeah, I thought this book was great. It's some of the best writing that I've ever seen in a horror novel, and I was also also 100% here for the romances happening in this book. Like, I loved the romance. Then the next book that I read this month was The Wedding Ringer, and this is a new romance novel that I just think, oh my god, it's absolutely adorable. So we're following our main protagonist Willa in this book, and she's sitting in a coffee shop when this complete stranger named Macy approaches her and asks if she can pretend to be one of her close friends and one of her bridesmaids in her wedding so that her husband thinks that she has more friends than she does. And I freaking love this book because not only is the romance in this book really cute, but it's also really about friendship. Like, at the heart of the story, it's about this friendship between these two women. It kind of has major, like, I love you man vibes, but like more romantic comedy side and less just like comedy. And then the romance that happens in this book is between Willa and one of the groomsmen that's like really close to the husband of this girl. And so there's just like this really cute friend group happening. You know, as I mentioned, I really do love books that follow weddings for some reason. And so I loved that aspect of this book. My only complaint is that I kind of wish the romance in this book ended up happening between the two girls because oh my god, how cute would that have been? Like, I was shipping it so hard, to be honest, and like, yeah, they made really cute friends, but like, I was like, they understand each other, like they need to be together, and so I was shipping them harder than I was shipping the romance that was actually going on with her and that dude. And so I feel like this would have been a 5-star book for me if the romance had ended up happening between the two female leads because they were both so cute. But yeah, I ended up giving this one 4 stars. I think it's a super cute romance and just like the perfect kind of book to just to take your mind off things and get lost in, you know. It was a good time. The next 2 books that I read were my first rereads of the month because it was The Push and Near the Bone, and these were both books that I included in a rereading vlog that I posted, so I don't want to get too much into this because you guys already know how I feel about these books. They're both in my top 10 favorite books of the year, and I just absolutely love them so much. This one, Near the Bone, is more horror. It's really intense, it's mysterious, there's a good plot twist, and there's very like isolated mountain vibes in this one. And then The Push is more of like a psychological thriller. We're following in the mind of this mother who is struggling with motherhood, and she doesn't know if she's cut out for this, and she doesn't know if she regrets having a child in the first place. It's very intense. The thriller aspect of this book doesn't really come in until the last like 30% of this book or so, but oh my god, freaking incredible. I'm obsessed with both of these books. I'm so glad that I reread them this month because it just solidified my obsession with them. Like, they're so great. So the next book that I read this month was A History of Wild Places, which ended up being in my top favorite books of the year. And this story was something completely unexpected for me because I don't know why I was expecting this to be a little bit more like fantasy or like magical realism than it ended up being, because at the heart of this story, it's a really great mystery novel. And so in this book, we're following this man named Travis, who he has these kind of magical abilities to be able to like touch an object and know where that person was last, where they've last been. Like, he can see their final moments. And so he gets hired to find this children's author who recently went missing, and she was always kind of known for writing these really dark and kind of graphic children's books, and she was very controversial because people thought she shouldn't be writing children's books with that kind of subject matter. And so he gets hired to find her, and then he goes missing trying to find her. And so then this book is taking place a couple years after they've both gone missing, and we're following this group of people who live in the forest, and they're kind of like disconnected from the rest of the world, and they're trying to figure out, like, there's a mystery about like what happened to these people, where did they go. And this book has such an insanely good plot twist, and it's just such a beautifully written book. Like, the writing is just absolutely atmospheric, haunting, gorgeous, and I'm just kind of obsessed. Like, I don't know, I flew through this book so quickly. Like, this is one of the first books that I had read in like over a month without needing the audiobook, so that can tell you right there that it held my attention. Yeah, this was an easy 5 stars. It's one of my absolute favorites of the year. I can't wait to reread this book in the future. Like, I loved it so much. All right, the next book that I read this month was Life's Too Short by Abby Jimenez. I actually ended up listening to this one on audio through my library, and this is one that I have mixed feelings on, and I feel like with this romance author, I always have mixed feelings on her books because there's some things that I love about her books and there's some things that I absolutely can't stand about her books. But this book, I guess the problem that I have with this one is that it's a lot more sad and heavy and dark and depressing than you would be led to believe by this like cute, fluffy, beautiful cover. And I think I have the same issue with this one that I do with The Heart Principle by Helen Huang, is that this is like the third book in a romance trilogy, and the first two books in the series are pretty lighthearted from what I remember, you know, they're pretty lighthearted rom-coms, and that's the same with like the Helen Huang series. And then this third book is all of a sudden like incredibly sad and really dark and depressing and a lot heavier of subject matter than the previous two books in the series. And that's exactly how I felt about The Heart Principle. I mean, I definitely think The Heart Principle is the superior book out of these two, just in comparison. But I'm not a huge fan of this trend that I'm seeing now with romance books, where the third book in a series of typically lighthearted and really fun romance books ends up being really dark and a lot heavier than I was expecting it to be. Because most of the time when I go in to read a romance book, I'm just kind of expecting something like, you know, fun, lighthearted, and not anything that's going to take too much of a toll on my heart. I don't have any issues with romances being sad, because I know that's just like a part of life. That's a part of, you know, reading romance. Like sometimes they're sad. But I guess my issue is when it's the third book in a series of some otherwise really lighthearted rom-com stories, because then I go in with a certain expectation. And also, like, mild spoiler, I guess, about the ending of this book, like, mild, but I hate the way that this author ends her stories. I think they're such bullshit and such, like, ridiculous endings. And I do talk about it a little bit more in a spoiler review on my Goodreads, so I'll link it down below if you want to know like exactly what I'm talking about and why the ending pisses me off so much. But just to avoid talking about spoilers in this video, I'll just direct you to that link down below. But oh my god, it's just, her endings are so frustrating and they're such bullshit. I can't stand it. But anyways, I ended up giving this one 3 stars because there were some things that I enjoyed about it. Like, I really did like the characters in this book. I like that we get both of their point of views, and I do for the most part like this author's writing style. I think she creates really genuine, like, good banter between the characters, and I did care about both of them. And I will still be reading probably anything that this author comes out with in the future. I always feel very like about her books, you know? And then the next 2 books that I read this month were Ugly Love and Confess by Colleen Hoover. I read both of these in my Colleen Hoover rereading vlog, so if you missed that, I'll link it down below. But I'm about to spoil that vlog for you if you haven't seen it, because I didn't really enjoy these as much a second time around, which is super unfortunate. I wasn't sure about Confess, because Confess is one that I have not read in a really long time, and to be honest, I have the worst memory on this book. Like, I could not remember for the life of me anything about this book. And this time around, I ended up giving it 2 stars, and I was really disappointed. I just thought the characters were so annoying and so obnoxious to read about, and I couldn't stand them, couldn't tolerate them. This was 2 stars. And then Ugly Love, I'm kind of sad because this is one that I was expecting to love again the second time around, because this is one that I always ranked very high when it comes to my favorite Colleen Hoover romances, but I haven't read this book since 2014, you know, so it's been quite a minute since I've read it, and this time around it was a 3 star. Like, I didn't hate it and I didn't dislike it as much as some of these other Colleen Hoovers that I reread, but this one was just not that great. I don't know, like, I just was not a fan of Miles' character, like, especially towards the end. He was just so controlling and such a douchebag. Like, I just couldn't even stand him. I know that this is like a trend in romance, like, there's probably a lot of girls out there that really love Miles Archer, but I just personally can't stand characters like his, because just because you've had like a traumatic past does not give you an excuse to be a douchebag to people. Like, I can't stand it. And there were some very blurry lines with like with the consent. Like, I don't know if this female protagonist really gave consent. Like, there were some really cringy sex scenes in this that I was like, ooh, I don't know about that. So yeah, it was 3 stars. I didn't hate it, but I was just kind of frustrated the whole time. And then I ended up rereading The Cabin at the End of the World by Paul Tremblay. This is one of my favorite like thriller horror books of all time. I haven't read it since 2018, so it's been a couple of years. And this was such a great rereading experience, except for the fact that I was not a huge fan of this on audio. I don't even know how to explain to you what my issue is with this audiobook, but I just do not like the audiobook. I don't like her narration style, and I don't know why they even have a female narrator on this audiobook where it's mostly male characters. And I don't like anything about the audiobook. So if you've ever DNF'd this book because you didn't like the audiobook, I would highly recommend just reading it physically, because I think reading this book is a lot more suspenseful and it's just a lot better that way, in my opinion. But yeah, this was still 5 stars. This was so freaking good. I'm just kind of obsessed with the concept of this book, you know, because if you didn't know, it just follows these 2 dads who are out at their cabin with their adopted daughter Wen, and then these 4 people show up and they request that they do something that is so freaking awful, and if they don't, the world is literally gonna end. And this book is just so fascinating. It's so well written. It's so intense and suspenseful. Like, my heart was racing the whole time for them. And the ending of this book is just so fascinating. I love the ending of this book. I think it's great. So this was another 5-star. And then the next book that I read this month was Wishy, We're Here, and I ended up listening to this one on audio because Libro actually had it as an ALC this month. So I listened to this one, and this book is a really difficult book to even talk about, you know, because it takes place during the coronavirus pandemic. So in this story, we're following this really frustrating protagonist named Diana, who is like, she has her life like on track, you know, she's gonna get engaged by 30 and have kids by 35, and like everything's gonna go according to plan. She's with this really great guy who's a doctor. He works like, you know, in the hospital, and then right before they're about to go on this trip to the Galapagos, COVID starts happening, and then he's like really needed at the hospital, and they don't know if they can give him the time off to take this vacation anymore. So he kind of tells her like, oh, you should go anyway, and like I'm gonna take care of things at the hospital because they really need me. And so she goes on this trip to the Galapagos, and then it's about how she gets stranded at the Galapagos because COVID breaks out and everybody goes into quarantine and there's like no more flights, and it's supposed to be like, you know, a very stressful situation for her to be like separated from her, you know, future husband. And I don't know, I just thought that this book was so frustrating because it's hard to feel bad for her, you know, because not only did she make the decision to actually go anyways during like the early days of COVID, but also just like, I don't know, like, do I really feel bad that you're like stranded on this beautiful island? Like, there are worse things in the world. Like, I don't know, I was just so frustrated with our main character because she complains so fucking much in this book, and it's like, dude, COVID is literally happening in the world. Do you not understand how shitty things are for other people right now? Like, she was just very selfish, very frustrating to read about. Like, I get her situation was tough, but like, oh my god, it's just like her complaining nonstop. And not only was that frustrating enough about this book, but there's this like plot twist about halfway through the book that was just it was ridiculous. Like, I get what this author's trying to do, okay, I get it, but what the fuck? It was just, oh, it was bad. Like, honestly, if I hadn't filmed my worst books of the year video already, this might have made an appearance in there because this was ridiculous. And if you've read this book, you probably know exactly what I'm talking about, but if you haven't, I don't really think I would recommend this. I would say skip it, don't waste your time. It's also, you know, really hard right now still to read about COVID in this way because it's very like spot on with like the early stages of the COVID pandemic and like what we were all feeling. Like, it's scary to revisit this so soon, especially in a novel like this where it's just like a contemporary, you know, story where we're just supposed to be feeling it. Like, it's not fun. So I ended up giving this one 2 stars. It was not my jam. I really don't understand the hype with this book. Like, I don't get it at all. And then the last reread that I had this year was The Troop by Nick Cutter. This was such a lovely rereading experience because this is one of my all-time favorite horror books, and this is the book that I actually credit to getting me into horror in the first place, or kind of getting me obsessed with horror. And yeah, this book was included in my rereading vlog, so I can link that down below. This was really interesting to listen to on audio, to say the least, because this is very, you know, graphic and disturbing, and there's a lot of body horror in this book. So it's a lot about, you know, reading about freaking worms and like things under your skin and just like bleh. It's disgusting, but it's so good. Like, I just love this book so much, and this book was such a huge part of my life, not only because it got me really obsessed with horror, but I also named my book club The Book Troop after this book. So I'm just so grateful to this book. It's just really great. I still love it. It was still 5 stars. Right, and then I read Alone in Space by Tilly Walden. This one, I actually ended up checking this one out from my library. This one is like a young adult graphic novel. It's actually a collection of a bunch of different stories, and this collection is kind of interesting because it starts off with 3 short stories that were all written by this author, and then the end of this book is a bunch of little comics that were written by her when she was 16 to 20 years old. So they were written by her kind of a while ago, I think, but they're just like a bunch of short stuff. And this was like really interesting. I really loved the style of most of these like comics and the graphic novel. I just think it was really beautiful. Like, it was a lot of black and white with like pops of color, which I really liked about it. And some of these were just like so beautiful and stunning. I mean, there were some stories that worked better for me than others. Like, for example, the first story that's in this book was like very high fantasy, in my opinion, and it wasn't really my thing. So there's like some hits, some misses. But for the most part, I just think this is like a really beautiful and thoughtful collection. I really liked the parts of this book that had to do with like space, because like this is like alone in space, so it's kind of like a lot of the stories are themed around space, which I really liked. I ended up giving this collection like 3.5 stars. I thought it was perfectly fine. Then the next book that I ended up reading was actually a poetry collection. It was Flower Crowns and Fearsome Things by Amanda Lovelace. And this is an author that I've read quite a few of her books now, I'm pretty sure. I think this is like my third or fourth book that I've read from her. And this one I have such mixed feelings about because this one's really short, okay? It's only like 80 pages or so on my e-reader. And there were some things that I really enjoyed about it. Like I really loved some of the illustrations at the beginning of this book. There's like some really beautiful like flower kind of artwork at the beginning, which I thought was really cool. And some of the poems like really hit me, but honestly, like for the most part, a lot of these poems felt like very basic kind of like feminist poetry, you know, like these kind of read like tweets sometimes because they just felt so simplistic. One of my favorites though that I really liked was when she said horror movies are her favorite, but it's not because she wants someone to come put their arm around her or protect her during the scary parts. It's because she likes being frightened by something so much less dangerous than walking alone to her car at night. A movie could never murder her. I don't know, I just thought that that was really interesting and I liked the inclusion about like horror movies, so I liked that. But I don't know, I just have such mixed feelings about this one because like while I do love and support the messages that are within this text, I do think it's just kind of simple and kind of basic, and I've read so many of this author's work now that it's just starting to feel a little bit repetitive, and like I would like something a little different and new, you know? So for that reason, I ended up giving this one a 2.5 stars. It wasn't my fave. And then the last book that I read this year was You Better Be Lightning by Andrea Gibson. This one is another poetry collection that I've been meaning to get to, and honestly, I kind of love ending the year with some poetry. It's just very nice. And for the most part, I really did enjoy this poetry collection. I thought there were a lot of really great poems about queer youth and like what it's like to be queer in our society. This author is queer and they use they, them pronouns, by the way. And there was just a lot of really powerful stories throughout their poetry. This author is really good at having like a storytelling kind of poetry style, which I really enjoyed. Like there was a poem that was about Prince that I really liked. There was also part of a poem that I wrote down that I really liked because they said, no matter how it looks, you and everyone you know have hourglass figures, each breath a falling grain of sand. To truly live is to see right through the skin to the avalanche. If we never deny the inevitable end of the story, we will write it more beautiful while we're alive. Like that one was just really good, and there was a couple other ones like that brought tears to my eyes. Like one of them was Instead of Depression. There's one called Timepiece, Queer Youth Are 5 Times More Likely to Die by Suicide, and Homesick, A Plea for Our Planet. Yeah, there was quite a bit of poems about like climate change in this and just like, you know, what it's like to be a queer person in society. And there was just like a lot of really great thoughtful poems in this one. I ended up giving this one 4 stars because some of the poems just felt a little bit like, I don't know, like out of place, or like they didn't fit, or like some of the lines felt a little like cliche. One of the lines that I thought were just kind of like cringy is they said, everybody wants straight A's, give me some gay A's to work for. Like it's funny, but it was in the middle of like a mostly kind of serious poem, so it's just like stuff like that that I was like, okay. But for the most part, I really enjoyed this one. I gave it 4 stars. I find it so awkward and difficult sometimes to like rate poetry. It just doesn't feel right because it's like poetry just like evokes feelings from you, right? But anyways, I gave it 4 stars. So yeah, those are all of the books that I read in the month of December. I feel like overall December was just an okay reading month for me. Like the book that's gonna stand out in my mind the most is A History of Wild Places, but for the most part everything else was just like good, but it's not like sticking in my memory kind of good, you know? I mean, A Dowry of Blood was really good and really well written, but like, oh my god, A History of Wild Places was fantastic. But anyways, I'm really excited to start on my 2022 TBR. Like you have no idea, I'm so freaking pumped. And I'm hoping to be able to film my January TBR like pretty soon here because I would like to get my Winterween TBR in that video as well. And I'm just really excited. Like I have so many books that I want to read for Winterween that it's gonna be kind of tricky trying to narrow down what exactly I will have the time to get to, because I literally have a list of about like 10-ish books that I would love to read for Winterween, but realistically, I don't know if that'll be possible. Tomorrow on the 29th, I have a very exciting announcement going up tomorrow, so you can expect that. And then after the announcement video, I also have my like end of the year stats video going up before the end of the year, which I really love. And then I also have my like tier ranking every single book that I read this year video, which is going to be very exciting. So there's a few more videos before the end of the year that you'll be able to look forward to. And yeah, thank you so much for watching as always, and I will see you very soon with another video. Announcement coming tomorrow. Ooh, bye.